Hey guys, we're doing a case coverage of Mckesson versus Doe with Caitlin, Justin, Matt, and Josh. A little bit of case overview before we start. A high-profile Black Lives Matter activist, D. Ray Mckesson, was leading a crowd during a rally for police brutality following the death of Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He led the protest onto a highway in front of a police headquarters, and during that rally, uh, a police was struck by a rock from an unknown participant. D. Ray Mckesson was not the one to throw the rock. However, after he was released from jail, after 17 hours of being held there, he found out he was being sued by the police officer, Officer Doe, for inciting violence in the speech. Mckesson was sued for negligence during during the protest. Here are the prosecution's arguments.
And the prosecution argued that Mckesson negligently staged the protest in a way that was conducive to violence, and he should be held liable for that. And the reason he should be held liable is because Mckesson was unprotected by the First Amendment by leading the protest onto a highway in front of the police station, which in itself is illegal and a breach of safety for the fellow protesters. And by moving the protesters onto the highway, it's likely to incite more violence because once a law is broken, others are more likely to be broken as well. And Mckesson was negligent in leading those protesters onto the highway because under tort law, he failed to uphold his duty of care to the police and his fellow supporters as well.
Yeah, and number three, violence was foreseeable and likely. Once you lead a group of people, protesters, out onto not just a road, but a highway, you set a precedent that it is okay to break laws, and you're sending the message that we will do whatever it takes just to make a point. And that includes breaking laws and becoming more violent. Number four, Mckesson did nothing to prevent any violence. DeRay Mckesson is somebody who is a high-profile Black Lives Matter activist, and he was described by other people in the same realm as the king of Black protesters. Now, this is definitely somebody who you could assume is a voice that is going to be listened to. So if DeRay Mckesson says to his protesters, do not be violent, they're probably not going to be violent. If he says peace is a priority, peace will be a priority. But when you go and you take protesters, a group of angry protesters, onto a highway in front of a police headquarters, that does not exactly scream peace. And number five, he should be guilty of inciting lawless action. This is something that is solidified by multiple court cases in history, including Hess versus Indiana, which is a case that supported and expanded free speech, but it was only expanded because it wasn't a case where imminent disorder occurred, which was the case with Mckesson. Imminent disorder occurred when people started throwing rocks, people got hurt, and a group of angry protesters was on a highway. It's also further solidified by Brandenburg v. Ohio, which states by the courts that speech can be prohibited if it is likely to produce lawless action, which it did. There's a lot that Mckesson could have done to prevent violence.
We will now hear the defense's argument.
So in defense of Mckesson, he really has no association with the person who threw the rock, even though he was blamed for throwing the rock himself, aside from the attendants. He is a Black Lives Matter advocate with this group of people, but just because Mckesson looks like in this picture he was likely arrested before he even was thrown the rock. So because of his acts within the protest, not associated with the rock throwing whatsoever with the cop, it does look like he was already taken in his place.
Also, if Mckesson is considered liable, a lot of First Amendment opportunities would be severely wounded. People would be less likely in the future to use their freedom of speech in protests because of the chances they could be considered liable for the actions done by others who may have been influenced by their speech. So that's a big an issue of freedom of speech in terms of future protests and kind of like what is this impeding on their ability to say what they feel and what they want.
And considering the Black Lives Matter movement is for a police brutality, it's saying, like in this photo here of him being arrested, that he is standing for another issue outside of the rock. He wasn't trying to cause any harm with any of the police officers. Instead, that he is trying to prove a point for something that's completely different, an issue that's not related to the rock throwing to the police officer.
We will now hear any closing remarks from either side, the prosecution or the defense.
Yeah, my only remark is that if Mckesson is guilty, it's not going to prohibit future protest or freedom of speech simply because there's a right way to do protest. I'm not advocating against protesting, but there's a right way to do it, and it involves not breaking laws and not putting people into danger. You can protest all you want, you just can't go onto highways and disrupt the flow of traffic where people can get injured and even killed. So it's very simple. Don't put people into danger. You can still protest. You just can't put people into danger into a place where someone's going to get killed.
While I agree with your statement, I believe that the protests they were doing were effective because they were gaining recognition in the way they were doing it. I don't think that people should be throwing rocks and hurting people, but I also don't think Mckesson should be held liable because while he is a big presence in the Black Lives Matter community, these are also, adults and, people who should understand, right from wrong on their own without, having to be told what is you're allowed and not allowed to do. I think everyone knows that you shouldn't throw rocks at a cop.
But if Mckesson had just said, Mckesson, guy who's the king of black protesters, he said, guys, we must do whatever it takes to avoid being violent, or your leader is going to go into jail. Don't you think that would have prevented violence if he had said that?
I think he could have done more to prevent violence, but I don't think he is liable for any actions caused by it. But I do agree that he could have potentially done more, but I don't think he should be held liable.
He also is not responsible for how people react to certain situations. They all stand for the same the same issue at hand. So whatever is his responsibility doing is not someone else's, and vice versa.
If one of Mckesson's protesters had gotten hit by a car and killed, would he be liable for leading them out there?
And that is a very good question. But I think as we wrap up our closing remarks, we can finish the rest of the presentation. We are almost at 9 minutes.
Okay, we're going to talk about some key terms here.
So some important terms that were vital to the case are tort law is something incredibly important to keep in mind. Under tort law, which holds people in a position of authority accountable for being negligent, if you are proved to have been negligent and you failed to do something that it was your responsibility to do, and it resulted in someone getting hurt or some sort of damage occurring, then you can get into trouble. You can face punishment for that, which means you're failing. Under tort law, there's something called duty of care. So like someone in a position of authority like Mckesson would be responsible for failing to care for somebody.
And imminent lawless action is speech that incites criminal activity before law enforcement has an opportunity to intervene, which is not protected under the First Amendment. And then negligence, as Matt kind of mentioned, is Mckesson was negligent by leading the protesters onto the highway and forcing the police to get involved.
And then liability obviously deals with whether or not he can be held responsible for others' actions based off of what he said in his speech distinctions. Can it be considered as inciting violence, such as a statement such as no justice, no peace? Or where does the line kind of cross over between like directly telling someone to throw a rock or saying something that could be perceived by someone else as that's going to be the response to what they said?
Overall, with First Amendment that we have on here, a protest is an example of freedom of speech and just kind of the freedom of expression through what Black Lives Matter stands for. So that's why we added that in there as well.
So for who do we side with? We said that Mckesson is innocent of liability. Mckesson wasn't the one who physically threw the rock at the officer, and he had no association with the person who threw the rock outside of just their attendance at the protest. He wasn't present, or he wasn't unaware that the rock was even thrown at an officer. Mckesson was also asked to be there by local organizers because of his presence on social media and also within the Black Lives Matters organization and movement. For more evidence, this is our video that we made for the case. And here are our references.
Okay, thank you for watching.